And then Aidan, you shared a picture. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to end here because it's almost Aidan's turn. It is 7:30 exactly. And Tony, are you the host for tonight?
I am the host.
Well,
And
Tony, I guess I'm handing it over to you then.
okay. And when I asked Aiden, like I said, Aiden, hey, what's your story? What we can tell, what can we tell the people about you? He says, well, I'm just Aiden. And I said, well, you're going to graduate school, aren't you? And he's like, yeah, I'm going to graduate school starting this summer, and I'm going to graduate school for entomology. Applause, applause. And I said, well, how'd that come along, like more or less? Might be paraphrasing a little bit. It's like, well, I bought a used camera and I started taking pictures, and now I'm going to graduate school. So that's the story. Aiden, take it away.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, let me try to share my screen. Okay. Um, yeah, and I'll just say at the beginning that please feel free to participate in like an ongoing conversation. I find it really awkward when I like say things that I expect people to like respond to, and then it's Zoom, so nobody really says anything. And it's just kind of silence. So if that means you unmute yourself, that's okay. But yeah, feel free to put stuff and questions in the chat, and then Tony, I think, can just pop in and let me know that there's questions going on. So yeah, I'm Aidan Hersh. Like Tony said, I am a soon-to-be master's student at Washington State, and a board member at the Washington Native Bee Society. And I also volunteer with the Washington Bee Atlas. And yeah, a lot of other bee things that I've been doing over the last few years. And today, I'll be talking about my macro photography, and it'll be kind of like very image-based, picture-based, with information kind of sprinkled in rather than the other way around. So it's kind of more visually pleasing as opposed to just talking at you guys. So yeah, the first picture, the title picture, is from a recent trip to Costa Rica. So that's a Euglossa, an orchid bee, and it's flying towards a leaf that I baited with eucalyptus oil. And orchid bees collect a lot of different scented oils from like orchids and other sources to use for mating purposes. So that's what those giant legs are on the back, and I think I'll be talking about that later on. I guess I already did this, but about me, yeah, Washington Native Bee Society, Washington Bee Atlas. My macrophotography can be found on my website and on my Instagram. And then I'll soon be at Washington State University doing learning about pollinator fauna that are visiting Spalding's catchfly, which is an endangered species of flower that's endemic to Eastern Washington. And I take pictures of lots of different things. This is a little salamander that I found back home in California. Do a lot of fungi and little tiny springtails, some of the more fun things to photograph. They're really, really tiny, but they stand really still, so it's generally pretty easy. Then a few shots from Costa Rica. There are some beautiful frogs there, as well as some snakes. There's a snake and a lizard. So yeah, I really just like taking pictures of anything that's kind of small enough that makes sense to use a macro lens. And yeah, but today we're going to be talking about pollinators. And pollinators I generally group into like four major like groups of insects. The first one would be flies, which is the order Diptera, and probably one of the most like underappreciated pollinators, I'd say, in the world. I think they get a bad rep because we associate like maggots with flies, even though technically like bees and wasps and beetles, everything else also has a life stage that is like a maggot. But I guess because flies are in our food every once in a while, we don't tend to think of them as beneficial, but they are really, really vital pollinators. There's about 100,000 species or more described species are in the world, and about 18,000 in North America. And this is a little flower fly that I found in San Diego, just perched on the stigma of a flower. Here's another syrphid fly that I found in Bellingham. And so most flies are like generalist pollinators, so they're not necessarily specializing. Not that there aren't examples of specialist flies, but they're generally like go into whatever source of nectar they can find. And because they visit a lot of flowers, they do actually have comparable pollination contributions to bees in many cases. And I think there are some species of fly that are used as agricultural pollinators.
This is a great. Could you go back to that one?
Yeah,
Yeah, this is a great time to ask a question. The little stubby wings there, are they like wings that never develop, or what is there a purpose for them? The little like um where there would be two extra wings on a bee.
yeah,
Halters.
yeah. The halteres, they're just like evolutionarily, they used to be wings, but then they developed into these little like gyroscopic things that,
Oh, so they used to be wings, so they're not. So they're not going to be. They used to be wings, and now they're not needed anymore. That's interesting.
yeah, so a common ancestor of flies, I would assume, had wings, and then um, flies taxonomically developed into their own order, and they all have these little halteres that they help them balance and like kind of uh, yeah, it helps them with agility and like flying basically.
Specialized wings.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, and flies have some of the craziest eyes that I've ever seen in insects. This being an example of that. I mean, horse flies too, if you ever get to look at them up close, they kind of look like they're wearing like the Kanye West glasses. Um, and yeah, they're really diverse and they exhibit a lot of mimicry. So this one's mimicking a wasp. It even has some pretty long antennae for considering it's a fly, which at first glance might confuse people and might think it's a wasp, especially with that coloration. But it is in fact a fly. And there's another closer up of the eyes. Um, I don't know. Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, if you see one, they do the weirdest, cutest dance, and so they really stick out because they keep moving. They never stop moving. So if you see one, your eye will be drawn to them because of their movement. So once you see one, it's really obvious. But finding them is a different story.
Yeah, and the mimicry goes really far too. Like I was out looking for bees, and there are some bumbleflies up here that do have like the same color patterns of bumblebees. And also, if anybody's ever caught a bumblebee, you'll know that like you catch it in the net and it usually starts buzzing its wings and like makes a very distinct sound to try to scare you off from what it thinks is you trying to kill it probably. And catching the bumbleflies is the same thing. They actually like buzz with a very similar tone. And yeah, it's really confusing. Sometimes I'll be fooled up until the moment I look at it in a little tube. And here's another fly from Costa Rica. This one, I don't know much about any of the flies in Costa Rica, to be honest, but yeah, I thought it was really pretty. And
So
then, oh,
do all flies have the oxali like that, or I've this is
yeah,
the first time I've ever seen them that's so clearly photographed. That's an awesome photograph.
yeah, as far as I know, they should all have ocelli. Although I think some like even some of the males, their eyes literally touch at the vertex, like their entire head is just like eyes.
Yeah,
Um,
that's what I thought. I thought that they kind of like grew over them, but now I'm seeing that they have. Wow, this is just I'm learning so much tonight.
This
I'm
one looks
glad.
happy.
Um, and this is a fly larva. So this is like what a syrphid fly, so all of those, pretty much all of the other flies that I had shown in adult form, this is what they look like when they're larvae, and they're kind of just like blobs. Um, but they are actually beneficial because these feed on like agricultural pests like aphids and thrips. And so even before they're pollinating, they're also serving an ecological role as a larva, but they don't look very like appealing at all, to be honest. So yeah, so that's flies. And now we can move on to beetles, which is the order Coleoptera. And yeah, another group that people might not associate with pollination per se, but if you do pay attention to flowers, like you see a lot of different types of beetles on them. That goes from like really large beetles all the way to like tiny little weevils that are just really, really small. And so these beetles will visit flowers for a variety of reasons, which means like they'll go there to feed on the pollen or on different parts of the flowers. They'll feed on other insects that are visiting those flowers, or they'll be there mating. You probably see a lot of these red soldier beetles mating on flowers, and or just being there for shelter as well. And so in the process, as you can see, they'll get covered in pollen and inevitably end up pollinating certain flowers. And this one is another one that's had its face down in the flowers and it's just covered in pollen. Beetles are the most diverse animal in terms of described species on the planet. So over 400,000 species have been described, and that basically makes up a quarter of all described animal species. So they are extremely diverse, although if we give ourselves a few more years, and by a few more years, probably like decades or centuries, wasps will definitely overtake beetles in terms of the most described species. But for now, they're the winners. They also exhibit some mimicry similar to flies. This one's a bumblebee mimicking beetle. And yeah, at like a first glance, you might think that it is a bumblebee. It has like a little bit of a hairy butt and similar color pattern. But yeah, just a beetle using some mimicry to hopefully fend off some predators that would think twice about eating it.
Aidan, have you seen them fly?
These bumblebee mimics?
Yeah.
I haven't.
They're just awful flyers. They're just, I mean, you think of Bumble and bumblebees, but these things just like can't hardly stay in the air. They're really funny.
Yeah, beetles are not the most aerodynamic, in my experience. They have those like super hard elytra that just kind of get in the way. And then, yeah, they can get really large. It's kind of wild that some of them can even fly at all. And here's a native ladybird. I think it's called the flying saucer ladybird. And probably the majority of the ladybirds or ladybugs that you see in the US are like the introduced Asian ladybugs. But we do have quite a few natives, and so it's nice to see those out and about as well.
It's beautiful, Aidan. I love the water droplets.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a nice little effect. And here's an example of like a tiny, tiny, tiny beetle. So if you look close enough at some flowers, you'll see these guys, little weevils that are they're almost always like mating on the flowers, and also digging their long nose into the flower and eating the pollen or drinking up the nectar. They're really cute.
Reminds me of a strawberry root weevil.
Yeah, I don't actually know which species this is. I know I've found out the genus based on just lookalikes on INAT, so highly scientific approach. But yeah.
I had them laying eggs in the crown of my Sarracenia plants, and I didn't care which one it was. I had to uproot every damn plant and kick those nasty bugs out because I couldn't find a poison that would kill them.
Yep. Pest control. That's why most people get into entomology, but not me. And then butterflies and moths. I would say that these are, when you think of pollination, I mean, unless you're people in the native bee society, I think a lot of people think of butterflies especially as like the pollinator, which is relatively true, but in terms of like efficiency and the actual weight that they're carrying with regards to pollination services, they're not as important necessarily as bees, but nevertheless, they're still really, really important to our ecosystems for other reasons as well. There's about 160,000 species described in the world between butterflies and moths in the order Lepidoptera, and about 14,000 or more in North America. And you can tell just by looking at like the body shape, like why they might not be the most efficient pollinators, because pollination services are relying on like incidental contact between pollen and like the reproductive or the female reproductive organs of a plant. If this butterfly is just walking on a plant or feeding on the nectar of a flower, it's up on like stilty legs. It doesn't have a ton of hair on it, so it's not necessarily going to be causing the incidental contact between the male and female reproductive parts of a flower. Nevertheless, there are like specialist butterflies and moths that are obligate pollinators for certain plants, but you can tell that just by the body shape, it's not necessarily going to be as efficient as a bee might, or even a wasp. And the really important thing about butterflies and moths is that their larvae, caterpillars, are used by like nearly all North American land birds to rear their young. So with a decline in pollinators, or with the decline in butterflies rather, and moths, they that will absolutely have an effect on bird populations as well. And here's one of my favorite slides of the slideshow, which is when I was in Costa Rica, I spent a lot of hours at the light trap, which is just a sheet with a light pointed at it, and all of the nighttime bugs just flock to it, which includes like moths, butterflies, or just moths, I guess, since they're the nighttime version of butterflies, and praying mantis, beetles, all kinds of stuff would just fly to that light trap. And these were some of the moths that I found while I was staring at it endlessly. Some of my favorites, I think, are like the top left center one. It just looks like a garbage moth, which is like a really good strategy, honestly, to evade predators, just to pretend like you're trash or a leaf or like detritus. And then the bottom right one looks like a dog to me, like a scruffy dog, or maybe like an old man. And then the bottom right middle one is probably my favorite, just because it literally looks like it's on fire. It's fascinating. So yeah, the diversity is incredible within this order of insects, and they're also really important pollinators and food sources for birds. And that brings us to wasps, which are almost bees. And we'll get to bees after wasps. But first, wasps, like I said, they're extremely, extremely speciose, not necessarily in terms of described species yet, but in like expected species. So right now in the clade Apocrita, which includes bees and ants, but also like stinging wasps, there's about 140,000 described species, around 18,000 in North America. But within Hymenoptera, which is the order that includes also like parasitic wasps, that the conservative estimate is that there's like 880,000 or so, and probably more like over 1 million, 1 to 3 million species, since parasitic wasps kind of occupy a just absurd amount of ecological niches when it comes to parasitizing other insects.
Wow.
And so the first one there, this one is a Philanthus, which is a bee wolf, and it's called a bee wolf because it does this. This was a scene that I captured last year where I was just following this little agapostomen around the green bee, and this bee wolf came out of nowhere, and what they do is they grab the bee, they shove their stinger under its neck where there's not a lot of like shielding or protection, and they paralyze that bee, and then they take it back to like a nesting hole, and they'll lay an egg on it, and that bee will serve as the food source for the larva that will grow up and become another bee wolf. So it's a little brutal, but the insect world is brutal.
I have a really quick question.
Yeah.
Tina. So on your camera setup, do you have like extension tubes, or you just use a macro lens? Like, can you talk like 2 seconds about that to
Yeah.
capture an image like this?
Yeah. So for this one, I was using my Sony, which I've now upgraded to an Olympus camera, but almost all my pictures before this year, well, all of my pictures before this year were with a Sony A6500, and then I would use the Laowa 65mm, I believe, which does like 2 times macro, so 2 times magnification, and a flash and a diffuser. And if you want like soft light and things that aren't like highlights that aren't blown out, so like if I hadn't used a diffuser, the black on this wasp would probably just be like white from the light reflecting off of it. So an important part of like a good macro setup is definitely a diffuser, which a lot of several macro photographers on Instagram sell their own. So like Cygnustech is the one that I use, but there's other ones like AK Macro, I believe. And yeah, so I've never used like extension tubes. I just used a pure macro lens, and yeah, that's been my method.
Follow-up
Thank you.
question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tina.
I was just thanking them. Go ahead, Tony.
How close do you get to your subjects?
With this lens at full magnification, I mean, I'm probably like a few inches away. So that's like, that picture of a springtail at the beginning, that was like full magnification, and I'm probably within like an inch or two of it. For bees, I try to keep my distance a little more just because they're generally bigger, so they don't necessarily have to take up that much of the frame. So I could do like 1 times magnification or less, and then I can be like 6 inches, 8 inches away. Still pretty close, but when it comes to macro, it's not really that close.
So Aidan, while we're on this one, you said you were following the agapostumon around.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a hard time following a bee around with my naked eye. I can't imagine following it around at a matter of inches with a macro lens. How do you do this?
Yeah, so with this specific situation, it's like there's a huge patch of flowers. The behavior of the bee is kind of predictable in terms of like, okay, it's going to go fly to probably a flower right nearby the flower that it's currently on, and it's going to stay there for like 30 seconds or more, depending on the kind of bee it is, which you just kind of, I guess, learn by staring at them for long enough. And so I wasn't necessarily like pointing my camera at the bee the whole time. It was more like, okay, it's on this flower, wait for a sec, it flies off to the next one, then I know I have like a good, I don't know, 30 seconds or so to get my camera set up and like point it at it and get a good angle, and then I fire off a few shots. So I definitely don't follow things like through the lens. I just follow them, and then being familiar like with my camera, it's kind of easy to just know intuitively how far away I need to be, so I'm not like fiddling with it a bunch and lose the opportunity to shoot that bee. So yeah, a lot of it is just like learning the patterns that they have, the way they behave, how much time you're going to have when it's on a certain flower. And with this case, like it just like happened out of the corner of my eye almost, and within like 5 seconds it stung it and flew away. So I just like tried to get a good shot off, and luckily I caught this. Yeah, anybody else have any questions?
Aidan, Kelly Redding would like to say very interested in photo details. So I don't know if you're going more into camera stuff or not.
Yeah, maybe at the end I can just like do more stuff about photography specifically, because I realized I probably should have included some slides about that, but I did not.
Do you ever use a tripod?
Very rarely, only if I'm doing like mushrooms and like slime molds and stuff where they're not running away.
You're not chasing after them. Okay, that
Yeah.
makes sense. I
Yeah.
bought one, and then I'm like, why the heck am I going to be carrying this around chasing bees? I'm not going to have time to set it up.
Yeah, and plus it's like I'm turning like my body sideways and my camera sideways when I'm taking pictures a lot of the time. So it's like I would not want a giant stick poking out of or three
Yeah,
three
exactly.
sticks poking out of my camera.
No, but I found a shoulder rig really adds a lot of stability.
Mm,
It is counterweighted, so you've got a weight behind it,
Yeah.
so it's pretty level or
that's a
pretty
good idea.
level. And you got two hands to hold it, and then I've got a trigger from my right hand where I can actually trigger the shutter down low. So
Interesting.
Tina, you can use the tripod for slow motion videography. You have plenty of bees. That's like kind of like the next obvious step.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Oh, and here's the Bembix. I know I forgot who shared a Bembix picture earlier, but yeah, this is Bembix americana, which is the American sand wasp. They're very loud, so you'll notice them if they're around. And yeah, they do something similar to the bee wolves from the previous slides, but instead of bees, they're catching flies generally. So they'll paralyze a fly, or actually they might kill a fly, and they kill the flies and they don't keep them alive. And so they progressively provisioning their nest instead of like providing their larva with a dead or a paralyzed but alive bee or something. So they have to keep bringing more and more flies back to their larvae. This is the Sphex which I'm sure a lot of you have probably seen around. They're also very loud and large, and they nest in aggregations. And they dig little holes in the ground, and they provision them with katydids and crickets, also paralyzed, and then lay eggs on them. And this was a really great scene that I came across where there was a nesting aggregation of these wasps, and then the yellow jackets, that blurry one in the foreground, were flying around, and that green cricket or katydid, I'm not sure exactly what it is the prey that the Sphex had caught, and these opportunistic yellow jackets would just fly around and steal them. And it was easy for them for the most part because the digger wasps have like a very step-by-step sort of routine that it's if they can't really break out of it, it's just biologically ingrained into their head, right? So like they'll catch a katydid, they'll go back to their nest, they'll drop it outside their nest, and then they'll go into their nest, leaving it outside to check if there's any like intruders inside, and then they come back out and then they pull it in backwards. And they have to like make sure all of those steps happen one at a time in the correct order. Otherwise, they kind of have to restart the whole process. And so every time the wasp would go into the nest without the katydid, these yellow jackets would fly by and they'd just like sweep them up. And they're pretty big, like they're the same size as the yellow jacket, so they'd kind of struggle to fly away with them. And then every once in a while, the other wasps would come out of the nest and have to fight off these yellow jackets. I think I have a video here of one of them digging its little hole. So that picture of it with the handful of gravel is from what it's doing right here, which is going in and digging out a burrow. So every time it's coming out, it's bringing out a handful of dirt and just dumping it out front of the nest. So other wasps are things like cuckoo wasps, and this is a good example of another distinction between wasps and bees. They are pollinators, of course, because they're visiting these flowers for nectar, since all the adults are feeding on nectar, but they don't have any specialized hairs for carrying pollen around, since they're all feeding their young animal protein, right? So they're catching crickets or katydids, they're catching flies or they're catching bees, and that's what their young are feeding on. So they're not actually collecting pollen for any particular reason. It's just all incidental, like the other insects that we've been talking about. And so this is like one of the examples of a really, really hairless wasp.
So is this on a yarrow?
Yeah, this was on yarrow.
Okay. That may be what I saw up at Snoqualmie Pass then.
Yeah, it's a
Very
favorite.
small.
It's a favorite for some of these wasps for sure. And yeah, that brings us to bees, which is the main feature and the thing that I care about the most of all these bugs. And yeah, so bees are very, very similar to wasps. Actually, Lisa showed me a really good video by I forget, was it Joseph Wilson? The guy who wrote The Bees in Your Backyard. And he's another entomologist that studies bees. And a lot of people ask about like, well, what's the difference between a bee and a wasp? And he says like, well, it's hard to ask that question in that way because since bees are like derived from wasps, they evolved from wasps. It's like asking what's the difference between like a salmon and a fish? What's the difference between like a cat and a mammal? You can't really answer that question properly. They're both wasps. It's just that bees are classified differently because of their life histories and the way that they behave. But there are, of course, differences. One of the biggest is that they have specialized hairs that they use to transport pollen around, since they're feeding their young pollen instead of meat. And this is a great example of that. So this is an Agapostemon texanus, one of the more flashy bees that we have in Washington. And it's yeah, carrying a bunch of pollen on its femur and its trochanter. And bees are just extremely diverse. I picked some of the more like interesting examples here. Um, I also blew them all up to like the same size, so that part kind of got lost in the slideshow. But these are all bees of like varying sizes, varying colors, different life histories, and it really just shows the diversity that bees have or all around the world. There's about 20,000 species of them in the world, and in Washington we have probably more than 700. And yeah, we can explore some of that diversity and like learn some interesting facts along the way. Um, and here are the families of those bees. And you can forget about Mellidae because they're really rare here, and I've never seen one. I've never taken a picture of one. So everything that you'll see will cover the other 5 families, but not Mellidae. And short-tongued and long-tongued bees is a way to differentiate them. And it's kind of a misleading way of identifying them because it's only a very specific part of the tongue that we're talking about. It's not the actual full length of the tongue. But nevertheless, there are the short-tongued bees, there are the long-tongued bees. And then there are bees of lots of different sizes. This is probably the extreme on either end for what I've ever seen. We have a stingless bee from Costa Rica on the left. That's on my arm. So you know how small that is when you can see the arm hairs and my individual freckles. But that's probably like 2 millimeters, 3 millimeters at most. And then you have a Bombus vosnesensky queen on the right that's like over an inch long, and not even the biggest bumblebee that I've seen, but they're definitely some of the biggest that we have in like Western Washington are the vosnesensky queens. And I like to think about like how these sizes are affecting pollination, because here's an example of like a Dialectus, which is a tiny bee, and it's visiting camas, and it's like it's crawling up an individual stamen. And when you think about, okay, pollination needs to get the pollen from that stamen and the anther onto the stigma, it probably won't do that super easily unless it accidentally crawls up the stigma. Whereas on the same flower, you have this halictus, and it's kind of just like walking all over everything. It's got a bunch of pollen all over its body, and it's probably more likely to accidentally bring some pollen onto the stigma there. And so I think that it's really interesting to think about how size is affecting that pollination success. And the pollination that bees are providing for these flowers is the one thing that kind of all bees have in common for the most part, except for a certain group of cuckoo bees. But almost all bees are purposely transporting pollen around their environment, right? They're not necessarily purposefully pollinating the flowers, but because they are providing pollen and nectar for their young, they are very specifically collecting a bunch of pollen, going to another flower, collecting more pollen, and in that process, they're accidentally pollinating these flowers. And that's what makes them the key pollinators in like basically every environment on Earth. And that pollination happens through a variety of different methods because a lot of bees have a lot of different ways of collecting pollen and storing it on their body. So this is a megachile, and bees in this family and this genus, they collect pollen and store it on their abdomens, on the bottom of their abdomens. So you see all that orange hair on their bellies. That's where they pack it all in. And so for this kind of bee, it's probably even more easy for pollination to happen if they're like rubbing their bellies along the top of a flower, for example. Although I do know that when they're collecting pollen, they do stick their butts up in the air, so they know about that, and they definitely try to avoid it. And so, yeah, that's an example of like a different way that bees are transporting pollen around. And I don't want to like belabor this point too much, but I do think it's really interesting when we talk about pollination, and to be aware of like anthropomorphizing the way that we're talking about it and making it seem like both the players in this game, which is the bees and the flowers, have like an agenda and that they're doing things on purpose. But in reality, it's just like bees are trying to efficiently collect as much pollen as possible, and they're trying to minimize the loss of that pollen. Um, Whereas plants are trying to also minimize pollen loss since it's costly to create pollen, but they also need to give up some of it so that they can allow for pollination to happen. And so it's those two like relationships that are causing all of these this evolution in bee morphology and plant morphology. And so I will definitely fall into the trap of being like, bees want to do this or they're trying to do this, but that's not how natural selection works generally. Here's another example of a different way that bees transport pollen. This is a Hapropoda, and they have really long or large fluffy scopa, which are the hairs that they use to collect pollen on their hind tibia. This is a little dialectus, and you can see the individual pollen grains on it, and they collect them a little higher up on their leg, basically under their body. Here's an andrina that also collects it on its leg. And you'll notice that these differ from like honeybees or bumblebees because they're collecting all of this pollen dry. So there's more individual pollen grains. So honeybees and other corbiculate bees, which I'll describe in a second, they are like wetting their pollen down with their nectar that they've also collected, and they pack it in onto their leg. And so it's not like dry pollen grains like this. And then you got bees that don't collect pollen on the outside of their body. So this is something that some people might think is a wasp, and you can be forgiven for that because it looks very much like a wasp. This is a Hylaeus, and it collects pollen internally, and then it regurgitates it back in the nest when it gets back. So different than most other bees. And so here's a corbiculate bee. So a corbicula is that flat or rather concave surface that honeybees and bumblebees like this one have on their leg. And then it's surrounded by little hairs that are a little stiffer. And it provides like a little pocket for them to stick all their wetted down pollen in their corbicula. And definitely has like implications for pollination, right? Because, well, if it's all wet down and not falling off, it's probably less likely to pollinate things. But bumblebees kind of, they're still very important pollinators, especially because they are able to do a thing called buzz pollination, which is basically there are specific flowers that have what's called poricidal anthers, which are so the anther is what distributes the pollen, and they have little slits in them. And the only way to get the pollen out is to shake it or vibrate it. at a pretty high frequency. And so bumblebees, along with other types of bees, they're able to like unhook their wings from their wing muscles, and then they just vibrate their flight muscles, which are in their thorax. And that vibration will allow the pollen to escape those poricidal anthers.
Let me interrupt. I think there's a good conversation in chat about pollen fidelity. Pretty much the question is, how much do bees practice floral fidelity when foraging and staying on the same flower? I know some people have answered that already, but I thought it would be interesting for you to comment for everybody.
Yeah, from what I've learned, it's that in general, most bees like practice floral consistency or floral constancy, which is like on a certain foraging trip, they'll go to the same species of flower rather than going from one type of flower to a different type of flower. So um, I'm I don't know a ton about it, but from my understanding, most bees, especially bumblebees, do learn floral constancy, and it just allows them to be more efficient with the way that they're collecting pollen, so they don't have to like change their approach every different flower that they're visiting.
When you say approach, what do you mean? I mean, is it like just, I mean, just so everybody kind of understands kind of the mechanics of it?
Sure. Yeah, so like I guess a good example would be a lupin. Lupins have a very specific type of flower that is called like a keel mechanism. So they have to push down on the part of the flower, and then it reveals the anther that is holding the pollen. Not all bees know how to do that, and it's just like a different method that plant is requiring the bees to perform in order to obtain like the pollen reward. And then you have like poricidal anthers where you have to vibrate your flight wings to access the pollen. So a lot of flowers have different techniques that are required to access the reward. And I think evolutionarily bees have learned that it's more efficient to just go to the same flower in one foraging run than it is to go to a bunch of different ones.
Thanks.
Yeah. But yeah, like I said, they're still really important pollinators, even if they might be packing it in like a compact wet ball, because they're covered in hair. They're still going to get pollen all over themselves. And again, they can do buzz pollination, which not all bees can do. And with that, we can get into like bee sociality. So what percentage of bees are solitary, how many of them are social. And I think this is from the book, The Solitary Bees, which is a terrific book if you want to learn more about bees in general. But what is surprising to like most people that don't know a bunch about bees is that almost all of them are solitary. In fact, only 9.5% are actually social, and there's more parasitic bees than there are social bees, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. But yeah, basically more than 3/4 of the bees in the world are solitary. And what that means, well, first of all, here's an example of a social bee. So this is a stingless bee from Costa Rica, and you can see they're living together in one nest. They have basically guards outside that are protecting the nest, and they work together. They have overlapping generations and other qualities that make them what's called a eusocial species. And then you have bees like Calides, the genus Calides, which are purely solitary, but they do nest in aggregations. So a solitary bee, basically a quick definition, is like a female that is provisioning individual brood cells by herself. She's not working with a colony. She's not working with other bees to collect pollen. She has no workers. It's just her. But they may nest in like, for example, a cliffside or one patch of dirt, and there could be like hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of individual holes, but each bee is doing its own work. There's no cooperation between them. And this is a video that I took 2 days ago of an andrina, another example of a solitary bee. That's loud. And there she is emerging from her little hole in the sand. So she has just returned from like a foraging run. She had a bunch of pollen. I watched her go into that nest. And then she comes out, she's free of pollen because she's deposited it in a cell that she will later lay an egg in and then close up. And a bee will form inside of that cell. So yeah, that's an example of a solitary bee. But there's definitely like a spectrum of sociality in bees. So you have agapostomen, which are solitary, but they also may nest communally. So the females are still doing their own work, but they share the same entrance to a nesting hole. And then underneath it splits off into individual nesting holes. But they share the same entrance, and perhaps they even provide like guard duty for each other. Here's a picture of two that are really close to each other. Then you have Osmia lignaria, which is the blue orchard mason bee, which a lot of you wouldn't be surprised if you have the nesting blocks in your backyard. And this is a male that's emerging. Again, this is an example of a solitary species that nests gregariously. So they nest together in very close by, but again, only doing the individual work as females. And there's down one of the tubes where you can see the pollen mass with some nectar. Also, it's a little wetted down. And then that little white dot kind of thing in the center right is an egg that she's laid. And then this little like wedge of mud here is her beginning to close up that cell.
Have you ever given any thought to the idea that an aggregation is more an artifact left behind by successful nesting conditions rather than a social construct?
Definitely, yeah. I think like evolutionarily, it's likely that if they were successful at reproducing in that specific area, it would make sense for them to return there and maybe reuse nesting holes or dig new ones. But yeah, I think it's definitely more in terms of like it provides them with protection for individuals, and not necessarily that they're doing it for any social sort of reason. But when it comes to like, there are some bees that, based on environmental conditions, they will be social or they'll be solitary. So like in a good environmental condition, they might have a few workers that actually are providing resources for a queen, but then in like less abundant conditions, they might actually be solitary, which is really interesting to me. And then I think I skipped this one. So this is an example of what it looks like inside the brood cell of a leafcutter bee. So as the name suggests, they cut pieces of leaves and then wrap those around into a little cell and lay an egg on a mass of pollen. And so these are some that I found in my community garden. And I opened up one of them to see what it looks like inside. And that's one of the Megachile melanophia that's bringing back a piece of leaf to make a nest cell out of. And these are the males of Megachile, of that genus. And I'm using this slide to transition into the discussion of like male bees, because there's a lot of diversity among bees, but the one constant in the bee world is that males all serve the same purpose, and that's just to mate. They really don't do anything else. And they have a lot of crazy adaptations and morphological differences that are almost always purely for mating. So like those fuzzy arms for mating. Let's see. They use them to like stroke the antenna of the female usually, which does something to calm her down, or not sure exactly, but they got a lot more hair generally on their faces, and they have an extra segment on their antenna. So instead of 12, they have 13 antennal segments. And they lack specific pollen carrying apparatuses. So they're not going to have like, they will have a lot of hair, but none of it is specifically there to collect pollen, since they're not actually collecting pollen for any particular reason. They're just there to mate.
Aidan, do you know if that's a hoplitas? They have pointed antenna. That's all.
This should be a megachile. This is the same bee right here. So this is a megachile
Oh, okay.
as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, this is actually a funny story of finding this bee. It was laying in the flower like this, and I thought it might have been dead, but it turned out not to be. But I wasn't the only one interested in it, because there was another male that was flying around, and it wanted to know if this was a female that was available for mating. So it was just hovering there, and this is kind of what the male megachiles do, and other kind of bees. They will patrol a zone, and if they find something that they think is either a female or potentially an adversary, they'll just hover around and dive in at it. And so this one was very confused as to why this bee was not moving and didn't know whether it was a male or a female. Eventually it figured out that it was a male, and it flew away. But here's an example in one of my favorite pictures that I've taken of a female megachile, and the bee in the foreground, the blurry bee, is a male that's lining her up to go in and attempt to mate with her. And this is the aftermath of that. I don't think it was successful, and they fell off the flower and then kind of just were both shaken up, and then she returned to foraging, and he kind of probably flew off and felt embarrassed or something. This is a male orchid bee, kind of similar to the one that I had in the cover photo, and another example of some crazy adaptations that males have for mating purposes. So in this crazy big hind tibia, they store a bunch of different oils and scents, and create like a complex perfume that they use to attract females when it's ready to mate. Another example of some weird adaptations are the longhorned bees, so like Eucera and Melisodes. And this is a video that Lincoln Best showed us at B School, I believe, that I love, because it shows just the craziest behavior that I did not know bees could even manipulate their antennae like this. But that's a male using its antenna as it's mating to gently stroke the antenna of the female. But yeah, I did not know they could bend them like that. This video is by, oh, it doesn't say, but that's the title of the video if you want to find it at a later time. Longhorned bee mating behavior. It's really funny to watch.
Doesn't look anything like what the Andrina do.
No, and I witnessed that the other day too. Yeah, the Andrina just kind of mob the females, in some cases killing them. It's really unfortunate, but yeah, bee life is rough. And then the last example of like a male specifically, and also transitioning into a brief discussion about cuckoo bees. This is a male, and it's got a really, really spiny butt, a male Coleoptera. And these are parasitic bees, so they're brood parasites, or rather, I think kleptoparasitic is the proper term. So these bees, here's the female version of that species. They do not collect pollen. They do not construct nests. They're opportunists, and when they find their host bee, they will sneak into the nest when the female is not there, lay an egg on the pollen provisions that host bee has collected, and then those eggs are like usually shaped in a very specific way so that they're hidden or just very inconspicuous. And the larvae, when they hatch, they have like big jaws that are made for killing, and they'll hatch before the host bee, and then they will kill the host bee either in the egg form or in the larval form, depending on when they hatch. And then instead of the host bee's egg hatching later on, it will be one of these parasitic bees that will come out of that nest. So yeah, kleptoparasitism, klepto coming from the word for steal. So they're basically stealing all the provisions that the host bee has collected for its own young and using those instead. And you'll notice because of that lifestyle, they don't have any like pollen collecting hairs on them. This is another parasitic bee. They're all hairless for the most part, since they have no need to collect any pollen. So that's one of the most like common threats, I'd say. Not that it's like bad, that's part of the natural order of things, but one of the threats to bees. Another one, for example, being like mites. So if you ever look closely at your mason bees, perhaps that you have in your yard, you'll see that sometimes they have just a bunch of mites crawling all over them, and those are pollen mites. And also a kleptoparasite, since they are not physically harming the bees themselves. Rather, they're going in and they eat all of the pollen provisions, and then when the egg hatches for the mason bee has nothing to eat, so it dies. And those can spread like so easily with, especially when you're rearing mason bees like on a large scale. And the last threat, and kind of the last thing before I wrap up, is spiders. I find a lot of crab spiders that have caught bees in all over the place. The crab spiders are able to change the color of their bodies to more or less match the flower that they're on, and they don't make any webs. They just sit there and they wait and they ambush the flies or bees, whatever it may be, that go onto those flowers. And this was a Bombus melanopagus that I thought was just sitting there, but it turned out it was being eaten by a spider. So yeah, and when I practiced this presentation, my guinea pig that watched it told me that I shouldn't end on bees dying. So I just included some other photos that were nice to wrap it all up. They don't have any particular reason for being here. They're just nice photos that I like. So here's a Megachile paraherda, western leafcutter bee. Another shot of the Euglossa, the orchid bee coming in for landing to get some of that delicious eucalyptus oil. Here's a mason bee emerging from its nest, or its cocoon rather. Here's another orchid bee, and that one's crazy. Its tongue is longer than its body. It's wild how that even evolves, but really helpful for getting into those long flowers that have their nectaries hidden way down deep inside the flower. And then we got a Halictus, also on yarrow, covered in pollen. And yeah, another orchid bee, and the end of my presentation. So yeah, thank you everybody.
Wonderful presentation.
Yeah, I know people wanted to hear more about photography specific stuff. Is there anything? I'm trying to look through the chat. Anything that anybody wanted to
Nothing
know
specific
specifically?
out there. I think we just all want to take pictures as good as yours.
Yeah, if you could like post in chat your photography specs, that might
Yeah. Here's, I can't see my own camera, but let's see. Oh, there we go. Oh, and I'll unblur. So this is like the setup that I have now. The new like Olympus camera that I got, it's the OM1. Let me go over here. The lens is another Olympus lens, the 60 millimeter macro lens.
Aidan,
And
if you're
then,
going to show the camera, can you stop sharing the screen?
oh, I forgot I was doing that. Okay, there we go.
Yeah,
There's a good idea.
So yeah, so this is my setup. It's pretty compact, which I love about it, and doesn't really get in the way. So yeah, Olympus camera, Olympus lens, and then the flash is I forget what the brand is, to be completely honest. Oh, Godox. The Godox flash. It's a V350o. So this one specifically I chose because it has like the power to recycle really quickly, which means that if I want to do like focus stacking, it will allow me to take a bunch of pictures in quick succession with a flash.
And then what kind
And
of
then the diffuser.
Aidan, since you
Yeah.
switched to Olympus, have you been doing focus stacking?
Oh yeah, and I was doing it with the Sony, but it was all manual, right? So I would take a picture and then I would either physically move like a millimeter closer to the subject or I'd twist the focus lens gradually. Now that I have this camera that has the software that can do it automatically, it will take like 30, however many photos I want, essentially. And every photo, it will move a little bit closer to the subject automatically, and it can take those pictures like 10 pictures per second. If I have the flash at like a low enough power that it can recycle that quickly. And it honestly makes it as easy as taking like single shots in some cases. It's kind of unfair.
Yeah, with all the technology coming out, I think at some point we should have kind of like a roundabout about all how the different cameras people are using, different things, because y'all are learning from each other. I mean, you know.
Yeah, and it's like I remember when I was starting, I would be looking on like random photography forums, and Instagram was like a huge benefit for me to look at all these other photographers' photos and kind of learning what they were doing, looking at like if they post their settings and seeing what they were doing to get those photos. And I can definitely say like the diffuser makes a huge difference. Having a good diffuser, if you're looking for like high quality photos that are not overblown, like you can't take pictures with natural light generally at macro level, because the sun will kind of ruin the colors on things, or it will like ruin the highlights. But if you taking and also with like the shutter speed that you're going to have to use at that light level, you're probably not going to get things like stopped in time. They're going to be blurry. So with the flash, it allows you to really stop that image like right when it's happening, that moment, and then add on a diffuser, and it makes that light really soft, and just distribute it equally around the subject. So I would highly recommend investing in a diffuser. Yeah, Will says you can use natural light, absolutely, with practice. Good point. Yeah, I started with natural light and eventually realized I want the kind of pictures that like I was seeing on Instagram, and so I realized that I needed a flash to do that. But natural light is its own like skill.
All right. Any other questions, announcements? Oh yeah. Could you put up the slide with your contact information again?
Yeah. There we go.
I'd suggest doing a screenshot right now, and then you don't have to write all those down.
That's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm talking to everybody else.
I've started to do prints. I don't know. I'm not super savvy with the whole like running my own business, like shipping things sort of stuff. But if you live nearby, I'm more than happy to sell prints. And either you could pick them up or meet somewhere or something like that. But yeah, I have printed like some on metal, and I got a printer to print them on my own paper. So not everybody wants a bee or a bug on their wall, but it looks kind of cool.
I want bugs.
One where the orchid bee is flying straight at you on metal would be spectacular.
Yeah, I wish it wasn't so expensive, but hey, if you're willing to shell out that money, then.
And someone said, who's JJ, as that your photos are now at, being shown at Washington University.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you're gonna get a lot of coverage with these photos. They are just amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, I was pretty stoked to see them up at Western. And it's always nice to have them like blown up to that size. They printed them at like 24 by 32, so it's really cool to see them that large. Yeah, there's a lot of cool like photography and videography going on out there, and I do think delving into the world of videography is really appealing because a lot of this stuff is great when you stop that moment in time, but being able to like see the video footage, I think that's why people are so drawn to like those National Geographic shows, and when they have this footage of like, I don't know, leafcutter ants or something, because to be able to watch that in real time and see what they're doing up close is really incredible. And yeah, things like this camera that has like really good stabilization are super helpful. I've been able to take some nice videos, but yeah, videos is a whole other animal. So
Yeah, I'm excited. I'd actually upgraded to the Sony, the 6700, and it has focus stacking and
yeah,
and also does it supposedly has insect AI. So I want to see how that. We'll see.
Wow.
So thank you everybody, and we'll be posting a lot more YouTube videos, past and future, very soon. And so really appreciate everybody being here. And again, Aidan, just world-class stuff.
yeah.
And
Thanks everybody.
and thank you, Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Tony.
You got it.